So welcome all of you to another EIAS talk. This time we're covering Mongolia, and I'm Goethals, and my colleague Alessandra Tamponi are interviewing today Dr. Julian Dierkes. So welcome, Julian.
Thank you. Good to be here. Always happy to talk about Mongolia.
Dr. Dierkes is currently an associate professor at the Institute of Asian Research for the University of British Columbia, and he has been conducting research on Mongolia for quite a while right now. Thank you for coming here. So you have been researching development in Mongolia for quite some time. How would you assess the current political situation and spectrum in the country, especially given its rapid economic and political transformation of the past decades? Are there any specific development we should be keeping a close eye to?
Well, so we're coming up on another election. June 9th is the presidential election. It's always a bit of a struggle as a country specialist. I get very excited about developments and think, oh, look, there's something happening. This is very exciting. But then when I step back for a moment and say, okay, let's say over the last 2 decades, we've had sort of a moments of concern around democracy, highlights, changes in government, but overall, over these sort of 2 decades, it's been relatively stable. Democracy is sort of firmly in place. The economy has grown largely on the back of natural resource extraction and mining. Lots of things have happened, but one might also say it's all pretty steady as she goes. It's you know, there's no upheavals, there's no revolutions. And there are probably no revolutions on the horizon. Yet the day-to-day politics is kind of exciting as well.
Okay, well, you've mentioned the presidential elections of the 9th of June. How important are these actually? And also the candidates have now been announced. What is your assessment of the different candidates? I mean, also their profiles, their programs. What can we really expect from the elections and its outcome?
Yeah, exciting questions. I mean, obviously elections are always important, right? In any democracy. This Mongolia is no longer really a new democracy. It's been 30 years, so there isn't that concern of, oh, will there be another election or not? Everyone's expecting an election, it will happen. But at the same time, elections are important. They're a moment to celebrate democracy, but there are also potential moments of shifts in leadership. Now, this is the presidential election that comes, up until now, had always come a year after the parliamentary election. That will change with the next one because we have had constitutional changes in 2019 that have changed the presidency a little bit. So this will now be for a single 6-year term rather than a maximum 2-term 4 years each. So the setting is changing a little bit. Powers of the president have been somewhat curtailed by these constitutional changes. And there's been a bit of a shift of power to parliament instead. The 3 areas where the president does have an influence, partly because he, and it's been all he so far, and the 3 candidates are men, partly because he has a lectern to speak from, to speak to the nation. And so there's always some kind of moral power to this. But the 3 specific areas of policymaking really are international foreign relations, the military, and the judiciary. And so those are the areas where presidents, even with somewhat reduced powers now, do have an influence and where the candidates might make a difference. The setup is that the Mongolian People's Party has a supermajority in parliament, has won both the 2 last parliamentary elections in 2016 and 2020 to have a very large majority. Its former Prime Minister Huetsuk, who resigned as Prime Minister in January, is the candidate for the People's Party and is going into this election on the strength of having won the parliamentary election last year, which was largely in response to an initially very successful COVID response and some other policy measures around air pollution. So he's obviously a strong contender. The longtime opposition party is the Democratic Party, and it's now this this gets very murky and complicated. The Democratic Party seems to be in a bit of a death spiral. It seems to be eating itself from the inside out. And so it had a dispute over who was the real general secretary of the party, because you have to be a party in parliament to be able to nominate for president. So as it turns out now, the former general secretary, S. Erden, is the nominee for the Democratic Party. And then perhaps most excitingly, or the not quite wild card, but what makes this a bit more interesting is that Hun, the single seat sort of newish party, has nominated a man named Dierkes, who was a member of parliament from 2008 to 2012 already, but for a small party. And so he's a bit of an independent candidate, really, and running as an independent, and may have a shot at gathering around him Mongolians who are nervous that the People's Party has too much power. By having a supermajority in parliament, they want some kind of a balance, not necessarily an ideological or substance balance, but they just want another party to be involved. And so the question is, will Dierkes, this independent candidate, be able to gather that kind of sentiment, or will Erden for the Democratic Party group those people? And what will that mean in terms of anyone winning a majority? Will there be a second round? All very unclear. We can't quite tell yet. What will it mean? Well, as I said, the president's powers are somewhat curtailed. It's really in those three areas. We wouldn't expect any drastic shifts from any of these three. Probably the biggest potential shift lies with Dierkes, simply because of his status as an independent. He's an entrepreneur, internet businesses, online sort of businesses, and would probably take one might expect a sort of very pragmatic position and do some small things and probably treat the office differently than the others. But whether that means anything for specific policies would be relatively unclear. And I think the default is sort of that no matter who becomes president, overall the direction of the country stays the same.
Okay. Actually, I would like to pick in on one of the things that you said regarding international foreign relations. So what can we expect from the candidates or the coalition there? I mean, in case, in terms of specifically international and foreign relations, as this is, of course, what the EU and the US might be most interested in.
Yeah, so in the mid-90s, so 1990 was the Democratic Revolution, and much greater independence, obviously, from the Soviet Union. So in the 1990s, the Mongolian government formulated what's called the Third Neighbor Policy, and it has really been the basis of Mongolia's foreign relations. And its main content, its main aims are constructive relations with the two neighbors that Mongolia has, that's China and Russia, to the south and the north, respectively, but then also a deliberate attempt to build closer neighbor-like relations with many other countries, primarily with industrialized democracies. And so that doesn't just mean OECD countries, so obviously Europe, Japan, Australia, North America, but also means, for example, India as a fellow democracy, well, until recently anyway. And so that has really been the core of the Mongolian foreign policy, this balancing of good relationships with immediate neighbors and an attempt to build broader relationships. Now, the broader links with the world have been in some decline under current President Batulak, who has not been terribly interested in the third neighbors. Oddly enough, he was able to conclude a strategic partnership with the US, with that other president in the US who was not very interested in foreign relations, at least not the way most of us understand them. So there was this odd symbolic highlight of this relationship with the US, but substantively there hasn't been much happening with the third neighbors, nor with the UN that had also been a big focus for Mongolia. And so the question is a little bit whether any of these presidents are likely to, in a way, resuscitate that focus on third neighbors and thus on the EU and on the US to some extent. Huizuk, the candidate for the People's Party, has not shown himself to be particularly interested in foreign relations as prime minister. I think he's probably a little bit shy internationally. He would tend to, as many older Mongolians do, he would have good relations with Russia, but less personal than current President Batulak, who seems to have a particular joy in taking his shirt off together with President Putin. That's an aspect of foreign relations that's a bit mysterious to many of us, I think. He's not like that. He's just generally not so interested. Erden, entirely unclear. As General Secretary of the DP, I think there was no indication of a particular interest in foreign relations. He would be oppositional to the government, which is a People's Party government, so he may pick differences with the foreign ministry, unlike Horitsu, who would probably align himself very much with the foreign ministry. I think that's quite unclear. Now, Enchbat is a bit interesting, the independent candidate. He received his higher education in Russia, so speaks Russian and is, has some ties to Russia. I think very little to the Russia of Putin, I think. Enchbat speaks very good English. He runs internet businesses. That's an international business. And I think he would probably be seen by the immediate neighbors, by Russia and China, as relatively neutral, pragmatic, but would have a different kind of opportunity to reach out to third neighbors again. As a person, I think, through his personality. Whether he would be interested in that and would actually pursue that, I think is also unclear. And so, there's a couple of big questions looming. Mongolia is a candidate next year for the UN Security Council for the election, although it was sort of not quite ambushed, but Japan declared its candidacy after Mongolia did, and there's one country voted in from the Asian region, and so that's a kind of a tough battle, particularly because Mongolia is also quite friendly with Japan. Whether any of these candidates would step into that in a forceful manner, I think is quite unclear. And then the other big thing looming, of course, and this is where the EU becomes quite relevant, with the current chill on relations with China and the possible fate of the EU-China trade deal, with the fear of an emergence of an anti-China bloc to some extent. This is a big challenge for Mongolia because it's entirely dependent economically on China, but is not inclined towards China culturally or politically in any way. And so there's this risk of sort of getting caught between blocs. And whether any of these presidents would take a different position in that, I think is just not quite clear.
And connecting to the recent changes that the country is undergoing politically, like with a changing political landscape, we see that younger politicians are being presented. Like there seems to be a bit of a new generation of politicians presenting itself. What do you think we can expect from them, and how do you think it differs from the previous generation?
So I think that's true. There is definitely a generational change happening. And there also are some generational divides amongst voters. Now, ironically, the presidential election is not when we see this, because the minimum age to be nominated is 50. So I'm eligible, but not many young people are, obviously. So by the nature of how this particular office is set up, there are no young candidates in sight. So it's a little unclear how that will play out in this particular election, because there's no outlet for a different generation, right? They don't have a candidate in this. Having said that, we do the clearest example of a generational change is in the People's Party, and is embodied or personified, if you will, by the current Prime Minister, by Julian Dierkes, who was born, I think, in 1980 or 81, I forget. But so he's the first Prime Minister who was not socialized, at least not into adulthood, under state socialism. And so that's a significant change. We have a significantly large number of People's Party members of parliament who are of a similar generation. And the People's Party, in its history it's the successor of the State Socialist Party. So it's been in government since 1921, since the revolution, the Socialist Revolution. And it had a strong history of generational turnover. thinking in decade-long spans. And so that didn't always apply to the General Secretary of the Politburo, who tended to be older men, but there was this habit, this institutionalized turnover. And so Julian Dierkes, the Prime Minister, is meant to be the takeover of the 80s, of the MPP politicians who were born in the 80s. The DP hasn't made that switch at all. The DP continues to be led by veterans of the 1990 Democratic Revolution, who were young at that time, but are no longer, since that was 30 years ago. And there really has not been much of a generational turnover there. Enchbad, as the independent candidate, was nominated by Hun, this newish party that in last year's parliamentary election really sought to sort of rally that younger vote. It's an urban vote. It's a more internationally minded vote, perhaps. The result was perhaps a little disappointing. They only won one seat, and it's for us. I mean, all the contacts I have in Mongolia, not all of them, but many of the contacts I have, are internationally minded, foreign educated Mongolians on Twitter. Now that's exactly the crowd, that's the generational turnover, and that sees politics somewhat differently. And so it's tempting to think that there's much going on. Whether that actually translates into a majority in a presidential election is unclear. And that's one of the big questions. Will this new kind of politics focus on competency, on anti-corruption and sort of honesty and those sort of things, will that be a driver in this election, or will it be largely a rural, more conservative, not in political sense, but a small c conservative vote that will drive the outcomes? And will this be a setback possibly for a generational turnover?
You mentioned Oyun Erdene just now, and his cabinet presented a record of women for the country. And right now, the Mongolian parliament counts 24.9% of female candidates. How do you assess the gender balance and role of female politicians in Mongolia? Especially now that you also mentioned before, no female presidential candidate has been put forward.
Yeah, it's a mixed picture, as in everywhere. The world isn't changing as fast as many of us would like in that regard. Oyun Erdene has appointed some very prominent women, and some very competent women to his cabinet, which was welcome. Part of that younger group of MPs for the People's Party, it does include particularly younger women. Parliament in the past, perhaps one of the greatest moments of the Mongolian parliament in the last decade was a cross-party women's caucus 2 parliaments ago, in the 2012 to 2016 parliament, that managed to really push on domestic violence legislation and got that passed. And it was a real highlight of sort of legislative activism, if you will. But the flip side, no female candidate. We had, out of the, if you thought about maybe roughly 10 or a dozen kind of contenders for presidential nominations, there was a single one, Oyun Dierkes, who's been in politics for quite a while, was really the single woman. And when I had, in the last couple of months was talking to contacts in Mongolia, the common response was, oh, Mongolians won't vote for a woman. Now, obviously, this is particularly funny, as you can hear from my accent. I'm German originally, and no one even remembers a male German chancellor, so this comes as a surprise to many of us. And I don't think it's actually true, because in two presidential elections ago, in 2013, and Udvar, who was the former health minister, was the candidate for the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party as a woman. And received the full support of her party and managed about 10%. Now, the People's Revolutionary Party is not, despite its name, is not particularly socially progressive. I mean, this is an older voters' countryside vote. And so perhaps the least, I don't know if that's actually true, but not the place you would find a particular, activism. And so I think this notion of Mongolians won't vote for a woman is simply not true, and has remained untested. But it's a bit frustrating that out of all these presidential candidates, it seems like there hasn't been to people's minds, a viable female candidate. Julian Dierkes appointed some women, but he's had some struggles. He made some comments about women early in his tenure as prime minister that were not so well received. So there's more work to be done in that regard, and the change is too slow, I think, for all of our taste, as it really is everywhere in the world.
You've already briefly touched upon it as well, but this new presidential election is going to be the first one after the constitutional amendments of 2019. Can you briefly explain a bit like what these reforms actually included and why they are so crucial? I mean, is it really going to change anything major for the upcoming president? And how do they actually change the existing balance of power?
So will these amendments actually substantively change politics? I think that remains a little unclear. The history is such that in 1990 or in 1992, when the new constitution, the democratic constitution, was drafted, they drafted a model that's sort of a hybrid presidential parliamentary. And that has been a little bit of a struggle in that in some areas, just the powers have not been very clearly delineated. And has just led to some uncertainty, particularly when the president has been of a different party than the prime minister. And so that had been an ongoing debate. The 2019 amendment does not go either way. It doesn't go fully presidential, nor does it go fully parliamentary. But it does not shift towards more parliamentary power. And so the prime minister has been given more power. For example, the prime minister now appoints cabinet, and ministers are not voted on individually by parliament anymore. And so that's a bit of a shift of balance towards the prime minister. Parliament has been given some more power to set up ad hoc investigative committees of sorts. And it appears that this week an announcement was probably the first such committee being formed to look around the issues around the registration for the Democratic Party that led to this whole uncertainty about their presidential nominee. And the president has really has been curtailed in the role's power, particularly in the area of appointments in the judiciary. And so those are now made by the National Security Council, which has 3 members, the president, the prime minister, and the speaker of parliament. And so it's no longer the president who's very involved in these judicial appointments. That is probably the biggest substantial change. As I mentioned, it's a shift to a longer single term, and that has some repercussions, right? It means that someone comes into office for 6 years knowing that they won't be standing for re-election, and so that perhaps it changes their attitude somewhat. But how this relationship will work out, it's been antagonistic in the past, in that current President Batulak very much sees himself as an antipode, if you will, to the MPP prime minister. Obviously, if Huitsov wins the election and we have a People's Party prime minister and a People's Party president, then presumably that is a very convivial, right? And presumably they get along, and it wouldn't really test this new arrangement, and so we'd still not quite know whether these constitutional shifts have been very meaningful. If either Erden for the DP or Enchbad for the Hun Party, nominated by the Hun Party, is elected, then that would be more of a test, and we'd have to see.
There is another change that has been brought forward by the constitutional amendments, and it is the one in regards the definition of principle to use the natural resources, calling for a more sustainable use that takes into account citizens' health, for example, and the country's environment. Similar principles are also enlisted in the Vision 2050 long-term policy and also in the action plan for 2020-2024. Which do you think are the greatest challenges in terms of natural resources for the mining sector with those goals set in mind?
So I think there the constitutional change is entirely symbolic. I don't think it has any actual impact. The Vision 2050 is significant because it does attempt to develop an overarching agenda, strategic plan to move forward, where Mongolia has a lot of disparate plans, but this is an attempt to bring that together. I don't think it fundamentally takes a position on natural resources and how to balance some of those countervailing demands, right? So we've got obviously sustainable development goals, we've got environmental concerns, but the fundamental challenge remains that natural resources, and specifically mining, is the one area that is a big economic area where Mongolia has a real chance of leaping forward, of real advances in economic terms. And so it's a little bit like the relationship with China, total dependence, but hate it, right? It's kind of like that with mining, that there isn't much of an alternative, even when people don't particularly like it. Now, are some of these plans changing that balance? I don't think so. The biggest shift that may be on the horizon is that Mongolia obviously holds a lot of alternative energy potential, particularly solar, right? Huge landscape, 300 days of sunshine, beautiful sunshine. There's a huge potential for alternative energy that with some advances in transmission technology would be relatively easy to deliver to China, but possibly even to South Korea and Japan. So that would really shift things around. Obviously, brown coal is disappearing, so mining focused on coal is changing to that it's shifting entirely to coking coal. That is a business in decline. But then on the horizon, you have something like a solar industry, if you will, that would be very much identified with a response to a climate emergency globally and the like. So it may be more that the conditions Mongolia finds itself are changing rather than that the policies are changing. And so far, I think the policies aren't quite leading that change yet.
Okay. Well, this brings us back a bit to like the involvement of external partners again. So what can, the EU, the US, China, Canada, India even, what role can there be for them also in like supporting the developments in Mongolia, and what kind of cooperation could facilitate further reforms? Like what should they focus on, or what should be the priorities?
Many of those actors have been active in Mongolia for a long time, have put a lot of foreign aid into Mongolia. Most of that is declining or ending, right? The grants-based foreign aid is on the way out, in part because Mongolia is not that poor. So, for example, German bilateral aid is ending. Swiss Development Corporation is ending their activities. Japan is shifting, JICA is shifting from grants to loans. But that doesn't mean that cooperation is ending, obviously. It's shifting in nature and structure. And so there are many areas of potentially fruitful, mutually fruitful, but beneficial to Mongolia collaboration. It would be some of the areas where interactions, I think, would be most beneficial, continue to be most beneficial to Mongolia, are political development and the press in some ways. There's been some activities around that. There's very specific development activities. So the US Millennium Compact is entirely focused on fresh water supply to Ulaanbaatar, to the capital, a very important and very pressing issue. So there are some of those technical development issues remaining. Then the other piece that's more international is, democracy is not doing so well in the world. Mongolia is not, as everyone always says, it's a pretty unfriendly neighborhood to be a Democrat. And so the continued partnership of some of the most prominent democracies remains important, I think, to Mongolia. But it has this worrisome aspect to it that anything that looks like an anti-China bloc obviously puts Mongolia into a very uncomfortable position. And so it's a little hard to tell how that will play out and what approach EU governments might take in this regard. In a way, the safest route is the UN. And Mongolia has been very active in peacekeeping operations, for example. But before Japan's candidacy, this promise of Mongolia for the first time joining the Security Council would have been another step up at the UN level. And Mongolia is quite active in the in the grouping of the landlocked developing countries. I mean, these are all sort of fora that are politically a bit safer. And so, you know, wherever international partners can support Mongolia's efforts, I think everyone would benefit from that. The UN would, or the landlocked developing countries, and Mongolia would as well. And then there's always that very exciting topic of North Korea, of course, where Mongolia remains, you know, a country that has a different connection to North Korea than really any other. Now that has been an issue that has receded in prominence again, partly because so much focus is on China these days. But that's always an area where a Mongolian connection is something that's of great use potentially to everyone, including China and Russia. And so generally these international links, I think, are important. And even as the bilateral relationships are shifting away from that kind of donor relationship, I do see much potential for ongoing partnerships.
Okay, I guess then all that rests is to wait the results of the 9th of June elections and to see what's coming up next for Mongolia, but also for its external partners and, well, everybody in the world, basically. So thank you very much, Dr. Dierkes. It's been a great pleasure having you on board today. You've enlightened us with a lot of new ideas and insights on Mongolia, and we definitely hope to extend this in the future, most likely after the elections. So
wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for great questions. As I said, always delighted to talk about Mongolia.
Thank you very much. Bye.